I think we'll get going. So, hi everyone. Afternoon to those of you that are in the US. Evening from the UK. This is the session on navigating a complex world: frameworks for understanding LGBTQ plus legislation and policy. Really excited that you've been able to join us for this session. I know there's loads of sessions happening right now. This session is being recorded and will be available afterwards, and we are also going to make some of the slides available too. There is quite a lot of information in this session, which you could probably guess from the title. Legislation is not an easy topic to cover in an hour. So there is quite a lot of complex information, but we will share as much of that afterwards, and hopefully you can go back and visit the recording too. So my name is Vicky. I'm head of global partnerships at Stonewall, and my pronouns are she and her. I lead the global workplace program at Stonewall, and I lead our intergovernmental activity and our civil society partnerships with other LGBT organisations across the world. For those of you that perhaps aren't familiar with Stonewall, Stonewall is the UK's largest LGBTQ plus charity, and we're one of the largest LGBT organisations in Europe. I think most businesses and organisations know us for our Diversity Champions programme, which is our best practice programme for employers. Alex, I'll pass to you.
Thanks, Vicky. Hi, everyone. Super excited to be here. I'm Alex Roddick. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Global Partnerships Manager at Stonewall. I've been here for about 3 years. I think this photo, which is on my LinkedIn, was taken at the start of those 3 years when I had a little bit more hair. But it's been a great journey. And yeah, I lead our work with global employers alongside Vicky and the team, and I focus on supporting 10 of the big global multinationals that we work with, as well as our wider work to evaluate how we can best support a whole range of global employers in their inclusion work.
So we are hoping that over the next 55 minutes, we will give a really good opportunity to deep dive into some of the really complex legislative frameworks that exist around LGBTQ plus rights, specifically the things that are relevant to the workplace, highlighting what those pieces of legislation are and why you might need to pay attention to them. So we'll do that using Stonewall's zoning framework, which is a framework that we've had now for the last 6 or 7 years, which helps to break up the countries of the world dependent on their LGBT legislation. So we'll deep dive into that, and I hope that that's a useful structure for you to take away and use in your organisations. We will then also spend a little bit of time comparing and contrasting what the law says versus what lived experience says. We know that if you mirror over the law and social attitudes or lived experience, those two things don't always say the same. So we're going to spend some time looking at what some of the distinct differences are and how you can use that knowledge to better your workplaces for LGBTQ plus people. And then towards the end of the session, we hope that we'll be able to share some really practical tips for employers for you to take away and embed in your organisation when you're thinking about how you might better understand the world and your activities that you do globally on LGBTQ plus inclusion. So I feel like this is quite an obvious question to start with. Why does understanding the law matter? So I think it's obvious that there are some really clear reasons why paying attention to the law matters. As a global business, you have to operate within the confines of the law, and there are often very big consequences for not doing so. But increasingly, we're seeing organisations explore the human, the moral, and the person-centred case for understanding the law in relation to LGBTQ plus rights. Businesses, I think, quite often find themselves saying they want to do work on diversity and inclusion because it's the right thing to do. But then when it comes to really challenging environments, the right thing to do isn't always possible within that legislative framework. And then all of a sudden, an organisation's values are thrown up in the air, and businesses can be really clouded by the complexities of the law and what they mean in reality for LGBTQ plus employees, and what that looks like for your inclusion programmes in the workplace. we know that the law can often act as a kind of a foundation for change, but not always. It can be a blocker, or it can enable further change later down the line. And there's so much more to understanding the law than just making sure that you're playing by the rule book. So we've just wanted to pay some time and attention to the other reasons why understanding the law can be really transformative for your LGBTQ+ employees. So understanding where some of the key challenges are in terms of physical safety for your employees in the workplace. How are they protected by hate crime and violence legislation, and what does that mean in your workplace, and to what extent does your duty of care extend? And in turn, if people are working or experiencing or living in places that doesn't offer them protection in the workplace or criminalizes their identity, what risk does that have to their psychological safety, and what additional things can you do as an employer to support someone in building that psychological safety in lieu of a strong legislative framework to protect people? We always want people to have the freedom to be themselves, and quite often that can be restricted in some countries because of that legislative framework. And understanding that that might be the case can really change the way that you think about your staff engagement initiatives. Perhaps if people aren't able to be free to be themselves, that means in some parts of the world, the way that people engage with your diversity and inclusion initiatives will really differ and change. By understanding global laws on LGBTQ+ rights, if you're an organisation that moves people around the world quite often, some of those people are bound to be LGBTQ+, and having that kind of broader understanding enables you to have really open conversations about some challenges that people might face whilst they travel, but also thinking back to your duty of care as an employer, and about what you might do to support them in those challenges when they travel. Much more than saying, don't be your authentic self when you travel. It's actually, how can we support you to be your authentic self with the legislation in mind? And being able to understand the law means your ERGs or your LGBT networks can much more confidently and appropriately support its members. They can change their engagement activities or slightly differ the way that they deliver them. We've seen much differing levels of engagement online virtually over the last 2 years, dependent on where people are based and the kind of legislative frameworks they find themselves in, particularly when they're at home. Often the workplace creates a safe space for people, but actually when they're back in a home setting and a home space, they're very aware of the law that perhaps doesn't protect them, and when their workplaces aren't there to support them. And it's a real opportunity to build partnerships. Local LGBT organisations are the very best people to help tell you about what the law is and what it means in practice. And doing a deep dive into legislation really opens up those opportunities to build really strong, close and sustainable relationships with LGBT organisations. And it also helps to challenge our assumptions. I think there are often times where people or organisations can make sweeping assumptions about a particular region and the legislation, but that perhaps isn't always the case, or perhaps it is the case that the legislation is restrictive, but the lived experience and social attitudes are far different. So it's an opportunity for us to really understand what assumptions we've made about countries and whether they stand true, and what we might need to do differently as a result. We produced a guide earlier this year called Side by Side, which we'll talk about a bit later, but this quote really stood out for me actually, from Rosanna, who runs Equal Ground, which is an LGBT organisation in Sri Lanka. And Rosanna said it's vital for global business to understand how the laws around LGBTIQ identities operate in all of the countries in which they have offices. Sometimes businesses are scared by the law on paper and don't think they can do this work, and that it's too much of a risk, but they haven't asked us how it actually operates in practice. And I think a lot of what's in Rosanna's quote we're going to try and unpick in this session.
But first, we want to hear from all of you. As always with the summit, we've got an amazing group of attendees from across the US, from across the world, and we really want your input into the session. So we'll be using the amazing tool of Slido, and we'd encourage everyone to go to their website, which is slido.com, and use our unique code. I'm putting it in our chat, which is very active, so really encourage everyone. to access it now and be able to share their thoughts through polls and questions as we go through. And I think to kick us off, we really wanted to start with, I guess, a gauge of confidence in the room. We've got such a diverse group of people on the session, and we'd love you to tell us in our first poll, how confident do you feel when we're talking about LGBTQ legislation around the world, that complex legal landscape? Are you a 1 or a 2 with a kind of a minimal confidence level, looking to upskill that hopefully in this session, or are you a 9 and a 10, and actually when we think about the legal landscape around the world, you feel pretty confident when you're thinking about how it impacts LGBTQ communities? So I'll give everyone a few seconds to go through, but yeah, no wrong answer, no right answer. We're just looking to see confidence in the room and see where everyone's up to and how everyone's feeling about this topic as a confidence level. So I think we've just closed the poll, and really interestingly, the majority of people, 21%, are telling us they're a confidence level 4, so really middle of the road. The second most popular being confidence level 3. So I guess on the lower end, when we're thinking about that legal landscape, which is really interesting to us. And I guess I just want to reiterate that, you know, we're really not looking for or expecting 9s and 10s in the session, and I don't think me and Vicky would class ourselves on that scale either. And really today is about not giving you the knowledge to in a pop quiz know all of the laws relating to LGBTQ people around the world, but more give you the tools and the kind of process to start thinking about this complex legal landscape and how it could impact your workplace. So let's dive in. I guess like the first of those tools that Vicky has already mentioned, it is Stonewall's own zoning system, and we'd really encourage people to use it and to engage with it. What is our zoning system and where did it come from? So several years ago, Stonewall built a 3-tier zoning system based on sexual orientation laws, but now has been expanded to gender identity. And it came from the vision that we wanted to assess how organizations approach sexual orientation equality globally. And within the zonings, we wanted to group countries into 3 broad zones, which would be based on, firstly, whether consensual same-sex sexual acts between adults in private were criminalized, and secondly, whether there was some kind of clear national employment protections that would ban discrimination based on the grounds of sexual orientation. And this grouping, I guess, was supposed to guide, as a first step, employers to think about and formulate approaches that could be adapted across different zones and start them thinking about different countries that they operate in and how they would tailor approaches. I think before we dive in, it's really important to say that as the system is based on a limited group of legal criteria, it definitely doesn't factor in lived experience, and that's why we're really keen to use the second half of this session to bring that lived experience in a bit more. And it's definitely not intended as a ranking of like, these are the best places to be LGBTQ and these are the worst places. But where we do use it is as a broad system, as a broad step guide to guide employers through formal tools like our own benchmarking index, but also offline tools like thinking about D&I initiatives and thinking about rolling them out globally and the challenges within that. So yeah, it's supposed to be for both of those reasons, but we'll go into more of what it can be used for in a second. So what do the zones actually entail? Zone 1 looks at countries where we have consensual same-sex sexual acts between adults in private not criminalized. And we also see the country having clear national employment protections against discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. Zone 2, we're also seeing some kind of legal parameters that don't criminalize same-sex sexual acts, but we don't see any clear national employment protections that ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. And finally, Zone 3, where consensual same-sex acts between adults in private are criminalized. So let's bring that to life. Like, what do we mean by these free zones? This is not an exhaustive list. If we tried to put all of the countries in these tiny boxes, I think everyone would need a magnifying glass to see them. But this is a snapshot of the kind of variety of countries that we see in all three of these zones. So zone 1 includes countries like Argentina, Poland, South Africa, the UK, the US. Zone 2 includes countries like the Bahamas, but also Hong Kong, the Philippines, Turkey. And zone 3 includes countries like Bangladesh through to Jamaica, Uganda, Zimbabwe. So I think a really important thing to point out is these zones do provide a framework to start thinking about the legal parameters that relate to sexual orientation. But there's some really interesting case studies in there. Like, we always bring out Mauritius, which is in zone 3 because of its criminalizing of same-sex acts, which it has historically criminalized. But really interesting for Mauritius that there is clear protections based on like employment protections for LGBT people. So again, we can see interesting examples and limitations in here, but it is supposed to be a broad zoning system that looks at specific laws and starts employers thinking about how that relates to different areas.
Thanks, Alex. Sorry, I think I preemptively moved the screen along. So that's our sexual orientation zoning system, and historically that's how we've broken up the world when supporting employers to frame their LGB work across their global networks or through their global policy or however that might be. More recently, we have committed to providing a gender identity framework for employers to be able to use for similar purposes, so that when they're planning their global trans inclusion work, they can be reasonably confident about the legislative frameworks that they're operating in, so that they can operate safely and be able to communicate that to their employees as much as possible. So our gender identity framework actually is just about to launch, so we can call this an exclusive, if you will, for Out and Equal. It'll be launching in the UK next week. But we wanted to follow a similar pattern to the way that we break up the world for sexual orientation. So in that, there are still 3 main categories of countries, but there are arguably much more complexities to consider when thinking about gender identity and legislation. So we've named these 3 categories ABC to be distinct from zones 1, 2, and 3. And the crucial factors here are whether or not a country has legal gender recognition. So a person who identifies as trans is able to legally have their gender recognised on formal paperwork, and whether or not employment protections exist on the grounds of gender identity. So you're protected from discrimination and harassment in the workplace by law if you are a trans person in a workplace. So those are the 2 kind of key things that we looked at when we were trying to break up the world into this system. So in Zone A, there are both legal gender recognition and employment protections for people. So that's the kind of like the most secure legislative position to be in. Followed by Zone B, which are the countries where there is legal gender recognition of trans people, but there are no employment protections. So you could experience lawful discrimination or harassment in the workplace, which does leave you very vulnerable to be wary or consider your job security. And then Zone 3 countries are countries where there is no legal gender recognition and or the criminalisation of trans people or trans identities through various different laws. So there is quite a lot of information in these slides, and we are going to make them available afterwards as well. So don't hurry to write everything down. We will be able to share them with you. But this initial framework really is designed to help give employers a basic overview of where trans people do and don't have that workplace protection, which is really helpful, I think, when you're thinking about staff engagement and understanding that trans people perhaps in a Zone B country might not feel as confident or comfortable sharing personal stories or experiences if they can't be confident that they wouldn't be subject to lawful discrimination by their employer. But there are some more very more distinct nuances to take into consideration when we're thinking about grouping countries by gender identity laws. And I think this is probably where it starts to get a little bit more complex. And I've used a colour coding system to try and help demystify it a little bit. So we wanted to consider as well the extent to which harmful restrictions play a role in these grouping of the countries, as well as whether or not a country recognises non-binary identities and non-binary people as part of their legal gender recognition. So by harmful restrictions, we mean restrictions that require anything that's contrary to a kind of self-determination approach to gender recognition and identity. So a requirement for surgical or hormonal treatment or sterilisation criteria, a requirement for people to be divorced before they transition and have that legally recognised, or a requirement to undergo a kind of real life test or something similar. So that is what we've deemed as a kind of harmful restriction to legal gender recognition. And that's where we've really started to be able to break down what the kind of world looks like by this legislation. So whether or not a country has harmful restrictions and or non-binary recognition affects whether they're a red, green or an amber across zones A, B and C. So it's slightly different for the last zone, for zone C, as these are countries with no legal gender recognition at all, or they actively criminalise trans people and trans identities. So let's just have a slightly closer look at some of the countries. So if we look at these countries, for example, you can see how these are broken down. So we can draw distinctions between countries who appear in similar groups but actually have quite different legislative gaps or challenges. And this is where the colour coding system has become quite useful and helpful. If we take the UK as an example, that appears in Zone A, which is understandable because we have legal gender recognition in the UK and employment protection for trans people. What we don't have, though, is a legal recognition of non-binary identities, and we do still have harmful restrictions with the kind of real life test as a requirement still, and kind of invasive questions by kind of medical professionals. And if we didn't have this distinction between the green, amber and red system, that would mean that the UK on the face of it looks the same as Malta, which as lots of us know is a country that's widely regarded as one of the best, or if not the best, country for legislative trans equality. So we really wanted to draw that distinction between the three zones so that it was clear there are still gaps, and we've identified non-binary recognition and harmful restrictions as the key to those gaps. What I think is just quite interesting to reflect on is that the most number of countries, we did as nearly all of the countries, probably 98% of the countries where we could find data, the most of those appear in Zone C in the amber category. And the Zone C red category is where there's active criminalisation of trans people. There are actually 11 countries in that category. And as Alex said, these example countries aren't exhaustive. They were just ones that we thought could be quite interesting for you all as employers.
So how do we use these zones with employers? So the organizations we work with come to us with questions like the ones on this slide. They ask us why, with people without workplace protections in countries that they operate in, are these people at an increased risk if we do this activity or that activity, and how they can protect people from further harm when they operate in countries that criminalize LGBT identities, or specifically criminalized parts of our community. And so we use this as a general tool to start them thinking about how they can roll out and adapt and tailor their activity. And that relates to 100% policy and policy rollouts, but also importantly, policy emphasis. So we talk a lot about the idea of potentially emphasizing things like a non-discrimination policy in zones where workplace protections don't exist. We work closely with network groups and the amazing ERGs around the world to think about about when they're doing global activity or local network activity, how they might consider these different zones and how they might tailor their approach to make sure that their activity resonates and keeps their members safe and engaged. We think about this in training 100% and awareness raising, and how an amazing global training can be even more amazing when the zones are used to adapt it and tailor it to different areas. And we get loads of questions based on self-ID and people doing global self-ID or global monitoring exercises. And again, using this as a first step to start thinking about the different contexts and different areas that they operate in. And finally, I think it's a really interesting model that we've seen lots of senior sponsors use and use as a first step in organizing themselves as a group of leaders, but also using it as a tool to start thinking about how and where they can do more and how they can do that safely and appropriately and upskill themselves on those different legal contexts that they're trying to create change in.
Alex. I've also just picked up on a few questions in the chat, and I think this maybe is a quick, timely opportunity to just reflect on some. So I saw a question about equal marriage and whether that's a part of this zoning. That isn't a part of this. So there are lots of other legislation that you could take into account. So things like hate crime legislation, for example, whether hate crimes on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity are legally recognised or not. We haven't included those here. We have purely focused on criminalisation, recognition and workplace protection, because the key purpose of this is to support employers to better understand where they need to kind of increase their emphasis on workplace protection and anti-discrimination across their global footprint. And we absolutely know that using a legislative framework in this way does not outline lived experience, and that's something that we actually just wanted to come on to, because we do know that there are lots of countries that can theoretically score well on a zoning system. They can be a zone 1 country with workplace protections for LGBT people, and same for trans people, but we know that that isn't always the case for reality or lived experience. And I think these are good examples perhaps. So Poland being a zone 1 country and a zone B country for gender identity kind of puts them sort of in a reasonably good position legislatively, but actually there is no recognition of hate crime legislation on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So none of that is recorded or recognised in law, and nobody can be penalised for committing that act. And as a result, there is a high level of violence towards the LGBT community, in particular from the state and judiciary. And we know that there are also low levels, especially currently, of public support for acceptance and equality of LGBT people, which has led to the rise of LGBT-free zones. And then we sort of see a slightly different story in Sri Lanka, not to say that the lived experience is overall hugely positive for everybody, but we know that it's a country that's not in practice highlighted well by a zoning system. It falls into zone 3 because it criminalizes same-sex sexual acts, but actually there are no restrictions on the kind of public formation of LGBT events or LGBT groups, as you saw, because we had a quote from an LGBT organisation in Sri Lanka earlier. There are much lower levels of state violence and non-state violence, and there is really active civil society participation, and there are community groups for people to utilise. So we know that the zoning system will only tell you one part of the story, and we wanted to be really clear that that is the case, and it's most definitely not intended to be a kind of ranking system of kind of best or worst places to live as an LGBT person. We also wanted to kind of reflect on the tendency, I think, for employers in particular, perhaps, to make some assumptions about legislation and experience, or law versus reality, I guess. We quite often hear quite sweeping statements that, you know, Western Europe's quite progressive, but the experience of LGBT people is highly positive, but we know that that isn't always the case. This picture on the left is a newspaper clipping from when equal marriage was passed in France in 2013. So again, France is a country that scores well on a zoning system, particularly for sexual orientation. But 150,000 people came to protest against equal marriage after it had passed. So we know that that isn't always followed up with social attitudes. And then on the contrary, I'm sure lots of you have heard about the anti-LGBT legislation being implemented in Hungary, and particularly directed towards young people and in education. That legislation that was announced over the summer has had a real backlash from communities at wide in Hungary, not just LGBTQ plus communities. Allies have also come out in their thousands to protest against the introduction of that anti-LGBT legislation. And again, we do often hear quite sweeping statements that Eastern Europe is further behind, and, you know, legislatively that might be the case, but we also need to remember what lived experience is like and where social attitudes are.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Vicky, and I think this is a great place to bring attendees in again, because we know that that legal landscape is important and that the laws govern how we experience the world, but also there's a huge range of other factors that that bring in you know, a huge impact onto our lives and how our day-to-day lives play out. So a question for the group again, and please feel free to jump back on Slido. We'd love to know, like, outside of the law, what kind of things impact your day-to-day life in the countries that you're dialing in from, and what kind of things impact you outside of the law. I think on Vicky's point from the earlier slide, like, one thing I've been reflecting on, and I think we've reflected on at Stonewall, is the impact of education. The UK have made some amazing strides in the last few years, but I think of my own experience as a gay man living in Northern England and growing up in an education system that didn't mention anything about LGBTQ identities, and the impact that had on myself and my generation, but the positive impact that will hopefully be seen for current LGBTQ people in the UK, and that's sitting fully outside the legal changes we've seen. So we'll give everyone a few minutes to add their things into the Slido poll. I'll post it into the chat again just in case. But yeah, I think it's a really important thing for us to reflect on, that the zoning system is important and something that we want people to be using, but we need people to also to think about lived experience as well. Give everyone a few more minutes.
Hopefully everyone's seeing this really great word cloud come up on their phones or screens.
Yeah, there's loads of great stuff in there. I think the big ones that are standing out is education, family. Social media is a really interesting one, and I think, again, something we're thinking about a lot more. Yeah, and stands completely outside of the legislation and legal framework that we're talking about today. So really interesting to see that one up there. Gay bars and clubs, interesting one. Social norms, religion. Yeah, there's some really great suggestions on here. So thank you everyone for sharing and for, yeah, giving us a bit more context that the legal landscape sits alongside all these really important factors. I think some of which we listed here as well, but most of which you've covered on Slido.
Are you happy for me to move on to the next slide? Yeah. So we also just wanted to spend some time thinking about the kind of practical things that employers can do to better understand the local context for LGBTQ plus people in their workplaces. You can sit at any desk and research or observe the legislative frameworks in particular countries. You can compartmentalize them using the Stonewall system or another kind of framework and system, but that won't give you the opportunity to understand what that lived experience is like, and also what all of those things in that word cloud mean to other people in other countries. And if we did this word cloud in another region or in another country, what would it look like, and what opportunities as employers and as colleagues have we got to really understand that? So some of the things we'd love for you to be able to take away from this session is a kind of immediate action to start mapping out that relevant workplace legislation, to understand who is and who isn't protected by anti-discrimination laws, and do this for sexual orientation and gender identity. I think it's really important that we do that distinctly, because you can't overlay those maps or those frameworks. They don't say the same things when we're looking at sexual orientation and gender identity, and quite often they say very different things. So it's really important to do those distinctly, and then to compare and contrast what your findings are. To be able to review your global and local and regional anti-discrimination policies to ensure that they explicitly do not tolerate discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. I saw a question in the chat, actually. I'm trying to keep on top of this as best as I can, so I'm sorry if I haven't come to yours yet. But the question said, we're a global company with offices in some of the not so LGBT friendly countries. Can we impose internal policies inside that office, or is it against the law because the country won't allow us? So it really would depend on what policy you were trying to implement or enforce. But we work with employers to make sure that they have a global anti-discrimination policy that explicitly states that under no circumstances do they tolerate discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. Those policies should really clearly outline what discrimination looks like for sexual orientation and gender identity. So you could use examples of bias questions in a recruitment process. You could use very real life examples about excluding people from meetings. You could extend this and look at bullying and harassment and outline what homophobic, biphobic and transphobic language looks like and include that in your policy. And by being so explicit, it means that you have a much greater opportunity to hold employees to account, and also really emphasize what your organizational values are. And then you can work with your local and regional teams to work out the best way to launch this policy. So although some countries do not offer workplace protections for LGBT people, dependent on what country you're working in, as an employer, you can say, we know the law doesn't offer workplace protection, but in this organisation, we don't tolerate discrimination, and it isn't acceptable. And that's how you can utilise your policies to offer that kind of additional level of protection for people that aren't currently protected in law. Other policies would be very dependent on where you're working. So having trans healthcare policies, for example, or transitioning at work policies for your global workplace, they would need to be reviewed and adapted based on your locality or your region. So make sure primarily that they don't put people at risk, that we're not outing somebody by utilising those policies in a country that criminalises trans people, for example, and that you're able to provide appropriate support based on the kind of legislative frameworks that you're in. So I hope that answers that question. And then the third thing that we'd love you to consider is to start to map out how the other laws, and we've talked about a lot of them, might affect lived experiences. So recognition and criminalisation and workplace protections are only some things that really shape experiences. And in some countries where they have active criminalisation of same-sex sexual acts, it's in law, but it's not in practice. Singapore, I think, is a frequently used example where that legislation isn't always applied, and lived experience is very different dependent on the geography in which you are living in. But perhaps in other countries, things like equal marriage or hate crime recognition in statute law could really shape and transform the experience of LGBT people in those countries. And whatever people are experiencing outside of the work ultimately has an impact on their experience in the workplace. And employers have a real opportunity to better understand that and build more supportive frameworks around it. So just thinking about those alternative laws, I'm sure lots of you are really familiar with ILGA, who produce this amazing map every year about sexual orientation laws in the world. So it's ilga.org, and you can download this map in a variety of different languages. They're a brilliant organisation. But they also mark on this map not only the protection against discrimination and criminalisation, but they also look at things like the legal recognition of families around marriage or adoption for same-sex couples. And they also look at the legal barriers to exercise your rights, so freedom of expression on LGBT issues, or freedom to operate as an LGBT group or organisation. So again, that can be really helpful when thinking about your network activity, perhaps, about whether there are any further restrictions that your network should be aware of about what they can or can't do in public settings, regardless of how inclusive your internal workplace is or feels. So I really recommend going onto ILGA's website and having a look at those maps. If you've got an opportunity to track the changes over the years, again, that's also really a really interesting exercise to do. Another area of kind of further legislative information that might be useful to you is from the TGEU, Transgender Europe. So they produce this map every year of Europe and Central Asia that looks at how trans people's lives are protected across all of these different countries. So the deeper the colour, the higher level of protection. And again, you can click through to those countries and read much more about the legislative frameworks and the lived experience of trans people in those countries. The data on trans law is really hard to find. So at the minute, this is only for Europe and Central Asia, but there may well be others that you are able to find. And if you do know of any, please share them in the chat as well.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, and we know, as we've gone through earlier in the section, that the law is one piece of the puzzle. And so alongside all the amazing stuff that Vicky's been talking about, we're also encouraging employers to start taking opportunities to learn more about lived experience and use that alongside this analysis that they're doing of the legal landscape they operate in. And for us, that kind of breaks down into two key areas of activity. The first is gaining colleague feedback, and that can be in a variety of ways, and a variety of safe ways is always what we would urge for, but finding mechanisms to collect feedback from colleagues about what their biggest challenges are outside of the workplace. I mean, we've had some amazing sharing today, even just on this session, and employers can do more to get that from their own colleague populations, and start getting some insights into what are the issues they should be advocating for their LGBTQ colleagues, and what are the business practices that aren't good enough and that aren't serving this community in different locations around the world. But I think alongside that, and a huge emphasis from us this year has been building partnerships with local civil society organisations and using those partnerships to deepen knowledge of what the real lived experience and real challenge for LGBT and Q communities is around the world. And I think it's important to highlight that in many countries around the world, there are specific trans organisations, queer organisations, specific organisations that really know that lived experience of our community, and can support and partner with employers for them to be able to better understand it, and for them to be able to use it alongside that legal landscape. As Vicky said at the start of the session, with the amazing quote from a partner in Sri Lanka, making that first step and having that conversation can be a real breakdown of barriers that have been stopping employers doing this work and employers driving change. And we know that employers want more guidance in this area. So we produced a guide this year that is available online, specifically looking at how employers can build strong and meaningful partnerships with LGBTQ organizations around the world, and how they can use those to drive change for their employees inside and communities outside of their business. And we've included this amazing quote from one of the businesses who took part in the guide and shared some good practice. I think a bit that stands out for me is collaborating with civil society allows us to better understand and serve our colleagues and customers. And that external piece is definitely very important, and is always something that we'd encourage employers to be doing more of.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, that resource that Alex has just shared is freely available to download online. If you just Google Stonewall side by side, it will come up. And when we share the deck, that slide should click through to the download as well, so that you'll have access to it. I'll just leave these up on the screen. These are just the 5 points that we've just ran through, just as a reminder as we move into the Q&A. So I have tried to keep track of a few, and I think I've answered some along the way. I have just seen one around some examples of safe ways to gain colleague feedback. I'll share my thoughts, and then Alex, of course, if you have some, please jump in. But we've seen organisations do this in a variety of ways. We've seen them upskill global network chairs on kind of safety and safeguarding and confidentiality, and then open up the direct access route to those global network chairs through a kind of confidential inbox to share that colleague feedback. We've seen organisations do it systematically, so where policies might come up for review every 3 years, they go through a kind of formal process to ask for feedback relevant to sexual orientation and gender identity, and create routes that would enable people to do that anonymously if they want to. And we also see kind of more general methods, but they always include additional safety mechanisms. So I've seen really good guidance from networks on how to clear your internet history, for example, if you're working from home and you want to be able to contribute to an LGBT conversation or LGBT related feedback, but you don't want to risk outing yourself to family perhaps, or you're not in a safe setting where you could do that. So really practical advice on kind of how to keep yourself safe when you're sharing that feedback is also really helpful.
I think it's a really good point, Vicky, and the power of a global anti-discrimination policy can't be overemphasized, and the power of communicating that. I think that's something that we almost bang on about every day at Stonewall, but yeah, the power of businesses being able to say to their staff globally that we have a policy that protects you is huge.
I also saw somebody post the trans legislation and issues in Asia Pacific, and a really great link that I hadn't seen before. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. Are there any questions that I've missed? And if there are, please feel free to just copy and paste them again into the chat box, and they'll come up straight in front of me.
I think I saw a comment earlier, or a discussion on the categorization of the US specifically, and yeah, people putting some really good input into like the lived experience and the legal experience, and how yeah, I think hopefully what's come across is that the zoning system is based on a very small set of laws and focused on those laws, and we know that it's specific and perhaps reductive sometimes in that approach, but it's definitely a first step in thinking about countries in broad legal terms. And yeah, it's I really appreciate those in the chat who shared their reflections on yeah, the actual context of the US and how we think about both the legal and yeah, state legislation as well, and the lived experience across.
Yeah, thank you for picking that up, Alex. I've just noticed in the chat as well, there's a question around corporations being more vocal on social media about LGBT+ laws in particular countries, and noting the referendum in Switzerland recently, and that many companies publicly express their support for a positive outcome. we really support organisations to participate in advocacy where it's safe and appropriate to do so. And I think that's the biggest caveat that I'd share. We have another guide actually, which isn't freely available online, but we can make it available perhaps through this slide deck, called Agents of Change, which outlines the kind of best practice steps an organisation should take when considering engaging in public advocacy. And really some of the key things are to be working with civil society to make sure that your advocacy is wanted, and that it's appropriate, and that it won't shine an unnecessary spotlight on a community that are currently trying to stay safe. So in countries perhaps like Poland and Hungary, we've had to work really closely with employers to make sure that their advocacy is in line with what LGBT organisations in Poland and Hungary want them to do, and that they're utilising that civil society voice, and that they are at no point increasing the risk of violence, where we know hate crime and street violence towards LGBT communities is on the rise. So I'd say, yes, we really strongly support advocacy, particularly for legislative change, but only where it's safe and appropriate to do so, and where you've actively engaged with local LGBT organisations to affirm that position. Sorry, go on, Alex.
I was going to say, I think we've just had one final question in the chat about tips for ERGs to influence large corporations to take more of a stance. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And what has been amazing for us to see in the history of the zoning system is ERGs using it to drive change internally, but also to really tailor their activity to like push the organization to do more and to do it more in a safe way. Like if we're specifically thinking about like advocacy and even just internal awareness raising, I think from my own experience, we've seen sometimes hesitancy from employers when chatting to and working with their internal ERGs to do activity, because they're worried about the law and the safety and yeah, breaking the law, because, you know, obviously, as Vicky said at the start, it's a big thing for employers and organizations to consider. And so the zoning system, when used well, we've seen it really help to drive those conversations forward, to say we can use this as a first step to understand like what we can do as an ERG and where we can do it and how we can push it further than just our head office or one or two regional offices. So yeah, I mean, would love to engage with the people in the chat talking about ERGs, about how they could use it to push their employer to do more.
I also saw a question around whether businesses are starting the practice of adding pronouns to business cards. I'd love to throw that out actually to the chat box. And if any of you are doing that or are thinking about doing that, please share kind of your recent experiences. I have seen lots of organisations start to add pronouns to email signatures, and also really importantly with a link to simple questions like what is a pronoun, particularly for countries that inherently have like very gendered or non-gendered languages. Being able to actually have a definition of what those words are and why they're used and why they're important is really helpful. So I've seen that happen quite a lot recently. Okay, great. It looks like there's lots of people that have had similar experiences.
I definitely add on that, Vicky, that Out and Equal have some amazing resources in this space on use of pronouns, but also, yeah, like adding them into signatures. I think they've also got some guidance in Portuguese on gender neutral language. So yeah, definitely we're big fans of Out and Equal and the guidance they've provided in this space.
There's a question in the Zoom chat around whether there are places where the law prohibits companies from protecting their LGBT people. I don't know of any off the top of my head. That's not to say that there aren't any. There are sometimes increasing increasingly quite strong legislative restrictions on funding LGBT organisations or groups, and where that money comes from, whether it comes from within the country or outside of the country. So that really mostly affects your partnerships with LGBT groups rather than how you protect LGBT colleagues. But for nearly all of the organisations that we work with, they really focus on producing a really strong global anti-discrimination policy and supporting local leaders to champion it and implement it in the countries that they work in.
I've also seen a question, and I think several comments throughout, about keeping up to date with this and the rapidly changing legal landscape, which is a really good point and something that we are trying to get better at. Our new zoning system, which Vicky mentioned, will launch next week, is being developed this year, so I guess is accurate of now. But going forward, we look at how to update that and the information sources, like Vicky said, especially when it comes to trans-specific legislation around the world. There's many different sources and many people doing great work. Like ILGA, I think for us is who we would go to first, and they have their own newsletter and their own resources to keep people up to date. So that might be a good first point of call for people. But I think alongside that, one big thing that we've seen work really well is coming back to that local partnership model, because frankly, local partners are going to be the first to know of legal and social changes that employers need to know about. And so again, just another reason for building those strong local partnerships, because they're going to be the ones that keep employers up to date and keep them in the loop.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Alex. I've just put the link to the ILGA state-sponsored homophobia report in the chat, which is definitely where we get a lot of the data from that has supported the development of the zoning system. And they do update that every single year. So I'd really strongly recommend kind of signing up to their mailings and keeping track of some of those legislative changes. And Outright and Human Rights Watch as well will do really brilliant briefings, weekly, monthly, quarterly, about some of the key legislative changes in particular that organisations should be aware of. So I haven't seen any more questions, I don't think, come in. I think I saw one question, which I can't find now, I'm so sorry, about the role of shareholders and whether and how they should become engaged, particularly in kind of key business decisions. We really strongly encourage all organisations to actively engage all stakeholders, including shareholders, not only on what's happening inside of the organisation, but where you choose to partner externally with other organisations. So we utilise a lot of the same mechanisms, like sharing resources, offering out training, being on top of best practice and sharing that, and making sure that any kind of advocacy work has a really clear business case, and that you can actively try and seek their buy-in before the work takes place. So I think we are coming up to the end of the session. Lots of questions in the chat about the deck. We will be sharing the deck. I didn't quite have time to share it beforehand, I'm sorry. But we will be sharing that afterwards. And like Alex says, the whole framework will be launching late next week. So if you're signed up to Stonewall workplace bulletins, then you should have access to that soon as well. I hope you have enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for your questions. I've most definitely loved looking at those and answering them. Alex, any final words you wanted to share?
No, I think just a huge thank you, as usual with the summit. It's been amazing to have everyone share their experience and share so openly with us. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to connect with you going forward.
Yeah, most definitely. Really big thanks to Out and Equal for having us, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.